I want to thank you all for this rather special opportunity. This is the first time that I've actually gotten to talk with a group of people who are prospective public intellectuals. That's the kind of the theme and focus of our gathering here in private, so that we don't have to be embarrassed about your ambitions to play a role, an effective role as intellectuals in actually affecting public policy. And part of the focus of our course together, over some 20 gatherings we're going to have, some 20 presentations and potentially some 10 discussion sessions, that we'll be trying to focus on what the distinction is between your role as a public intellectual, working either in universities or in university communities, in attempting to elevate both the political consciousness and potentially the spiritual consciousness of people who are going to be citizens participating in decision making. That's going to be the theme of this course, this secret relationship between the issue of consciousness and political action. And you'll note in some of the introductory readings that we had, you'll notice that in the Phi Beta Kappa presentations that were cited to you, one of which was Ralph Waldo Emerson and others, you'll notice that people who have achieved some of the highest levels of intellectual distinction within the university community, when they find themselves presented with an opportunity to actually talk to other Phi Beta Kappa people, they peculiarly gravitate toward this discussion of the limitations of the intellect. And they begin to start to discuss people like Dionysius, the Areopagite. They begin to discuss prophetic beings who actually have been fortunate enough to acquire wisdom as distinct from simply education from books. And that this theme is constantly returned to by people when they're in the intellectual community, when they find themselves confronted with a special situation in which they feel that they're called upon to reach down into an ethical place in themselves, to make a presentation that they view to be of ethical importance to themselves and hopefully to those to whom they're speaking. So this issue that has been raised in some of the preliminary readings that were assigned to you is the theme that I'm going to be addressing. That there is also an obligation that I have to attempt to bring to you some of the insights that I've gathered over the 45 years in practicing law, to some of the insights into politics and how things function really in the political realm. But that is the thing that I'm more known for. What I want to be able to do here in the confidence of our gatherings together, to share with you a vocation that I have had throughout this entire period, to attempt to probe into the other dimensions of consciousness and to try to bring back into the three-dimensional world of public policy and politics the issue of higher consciousness. Okay, so that's what I want to do then in talking with you both as members of the millennial generation, for the most part. Is there anyone here who is not between the ages of 33 and 10? We've got a couple on the edge, but basically not the students. See, so that this is the cohort of which you are a part, and it's in that context that I'm going to be working with you over these next 20 sessions to talk with you as both millennialists and as intellectuals, people who are working in the university communities and in the world of the intellect to attempt to garner truths from the writings of our forebearers and bringing to your process the process of creative thinking, creative reading, creative writing, and creative thinking, so that you can in fact provide breakthroughs in thinking that would not otherwise be available to the average student in the average state university or private institution. Because one of the fundamental themes of our gatherings here together in private in this upper room is to talk about the shortcomings of the state university system and the private university system. Not so much as to spend a lot of time wasted on that issue, but rather to point out the distinction between that type of experience and the one that we hope to provide to you here. And that is this, is that in the state universities and in the private run universities, it's not surprising that the professors in those university settings feel compelled in state universities to impart to the students the basic values of the state. Rudolf Steiner pointed this out, the famous spiritual person. He pointed out that if in fact you have a state provide the education to the youth, you should not be surprised that they do not teach you how to overthrow the state. And they foster and promote in you a set of beliefs in whatever the objectives of the state are. And I want to share with you just briefly that when I was at Harvard College, that we used to have this shopping week, which apparently now they have in most of the universities. But for a week before deciding what your course selections were going to be, you got to actually go to some of the lectures and listen to the professor, take a look at the reading list, and to look through the readings and to see if that's a course that you thought was going to be most helpful to you. And I remember back in 1965, I went and took a look at Henry Kissinger's course, Gov 180, in American Foreign Policy. And he came before us and he said, I was in the last all-male class at Harvard College. Out of 300 years to that point, we were the last all-male class, the graduating class of 1967. So it was a peculiar environment that we were in, both looking into the past of this all-male kind of bastion, and yet at the very cutting edge of the integration of women into an equal place now, where the women constitute almost 53% of the undergraduate class at Harvard. And in that course, we were there, the class filled with men, and Henry Kissinger came before us and said, those of you who are here today, he said, if you believe that a nation state is bound by the same ethical standards of individuals and would not be allowed to lie or steal or kill and to exploit the resources of others for the good of their own citizens, you should not be in this class. Okay? So, which caused me immediately to decide to stay in the class, because I wanted to see exactly what it is they were up to, pursuant to that set of plans. But what you really saw is that, in that case, in a private university, the faculty members of the private university were attempting to inculcate into the studentry the set of beliefs of those private financial people who supported the university. Not surprisingly, people pay for what they get, or they try to get what they pay for. And so that the private investors in a private university are seeking to turn out students who are going to foster and promote the same basic values that they have. And the state is the same way as state universities. Therefore, the value of a free university, where we are not supported by private financial interests who are going to be promoting some sort of set of beliefs that we have to impart to you, nor are we in a state university system where they are going to try to train you in the belief that state capitalism is the only really viable economic system in the world that you should consider. And they will put up other systems as straw systems to just knock down, but there's no doubt about them attempting to inculcate a firm belief in state capitalism, and also white racial superiority, by the by. To say nothing about male superiority, and a series of other basic cultural values that are embraced by the North American state. And so that what we're trying to do here is to try to assist you in breaking out of that type of training. That make no doubt about it, whether you come up through the system of state schools, both first and second levels of school, and then into the state universities, or through private schools, you have been subjected up to this point to one or another of those attempted indoctrinations. And one of the peculiar things is that here in the Western Academy, in the state academy and in the privately financed academy, that it turns out that they, strangely enough, teach you both how to become moderate to conservative rulers, but they also constantly expose you to the thinking of people who have been critical of the state. But they never quite intend to persuade you that that second group of people are the ones that you're supposed to follow. And so that you'll hear that old adage over and over again that, you know, if you're 20 years old and you're not a communist, you have no heart. And if by the time you get to be 50, you're not a capitalist, then you got no brains. You know, they love that cutie kind of expressions. And so that's basically what they're attempting to convey to you, is that it's okay while you're young and idealistic to believe in socialism and genuine egalitarianism, etc., but don't take it too seriously. Because when you get done at the university, you've got to go out and get a job. And you'll see in the writings that have been given to you already, you hear that theme being struck by public intellectuals. This issue of the university system being instrumentalist, that are attempting to train you as like a trade school, to get you ready to go out into the working world, to prepare you to become a cog, a useful cog in the wheel of a capitalist industrialist society. In their very sophisticated positions. It's not just that you have to be a laborer on the production line. You also have management officials, you have people who are involved in accounting, you have lawyers who protect their interests, you have bankers and financial investors. There's all kinds of sophisticated professions, but they all are basically being driven in one direction to prepare you to assist and facilitate this type of an enterprise. But there is another calling, a more ancient calling in the academy that dates back to the earliest gatherings of young people and discussions with some of their elders, which is designed to actually challenge this concept, to challenge the underlying concept of the state, to challenge the underlying concept of the utilitarian quality of education. That it is actually designed to train you to think creatively and as it were outside of the box, and also not to use trite cliches like that. That the training is to train you to be genuinely creative. And so what I want to do is I want to talk with you today in the first gathering that we have together here to be able to explain to you why I believe this is important for us to do together. And that is because I believe that William Strauss and Neil Howe, who I would recommend you might get their writings. There's a major book that they wrote. They're two sociologists from Harvard and Yale. They did their study actually at Notre Dame together. They wrote a major sociological study called Generations, the History of America's Future. And in this study, they interviewed thousands of people from different generations, and they basically elucidated a theme that has been touched upon by other writers in the past, but they brought it up to date, talking about the fact that in any given 100-year period, not necessarily delineated by the century marks, but in a 100-year cycle, there appears to be born 4 distinct generations. And that in every 100-year cycle, there is an idealist generation that is followed by the birth of a reactive generation, which in turn is followed by a civic generation, the 3 of which are followed in turn by an adaptive generation. And what they spelled out in that work is that an idealist generation begins to be born right at the brink of the solution to a major society-wide crisis. That there's a cultural crisis that has occurred in Western civilization, and that the young children who are born right at the beginning after the solution of that major crisis are born over a next 21 to 25 year period, and they're born into a society that has this kind of rising sense of elan, this kind of a sense of having overcome a major challenge to their culture. And during that period of time, this generation is trained to explore and delve into and believe in the basic ideals of that culture, because the culture has the luxury of just having overcome a major cultural crisis, and they're at their most optimistic now. And so they share these essential ideals with the young people. And what happens is that young generation, until they're 18 years old, basically imbibe that atmosphere. They soak up that set of ideals, and they come to believe in those ideals. But what happens is when they get to be between 18 and 20 years old, and you come out into the real world, all of a sudden they discover that the ideals that they have been taught by their previous generation turn out not to be true. It turns out that human beings don't function in accordance with those ideals. They tend to compromise on those ideals. In fact, they tend to be hypocrites. They tend to proselytize on behalf of those ideals publicly, but privately they don't practice them. And they'll actually pull you aside and knowingly tell you to knock it off. You know, look, you're grown up now, enough of that. You know, now you've got to deal with the real world here. Here's how the real world functions. And what I'll do in the next session or two that we have together, I'll tell you a few of those moments when over the 45-year period when I was pulled aside and said, look that's not how it really goes. We respect the fact that you've learned the ideals. We respect the fact that you've learned how to espouse the ideals, but don't really try to practice those ideals, or else at least don't do it here. Whether it's in a particular law firm, or whether it's trying to deal with a particular political party, or you're involved in a particular election, or a legal case of some sort, or dealing with a court, don't make the mistake of actually trying to live those ideals, or else go somewhere else. Okay, so we'll touch upon those things, because this is the archetypal experience that is encountered by the idealists when they get to be about 18 to 21 years old. And then what happens is there's a period for 10 years in the life of the idealist generation where the idealists rise up, refuse to accept that kind of conservative advice, and challenge the state, and challenge the society that they're in, and try to compel them to adhere to the ideals that they themselves have taught to them. And what happens, there's a 10-year period of a major surge that goes on in the life cycle of an idealist generation. And what happens is that the adults from their parents' generation who have taught them those ideals push back and suppress them and confront them. And what they do is they basically dig their heels in and refuse to listen to the advice of the ideals that they themselves have taught this younger generation to raise up and put up in front of them, to give themselves an opportunity to reform their culture, to reform their institutional structures. But they become so committed to those structures that they refuse to listen. And so what happens is, after that 10-year surge, the members of the idealist generation basically move into a new phase when they get to be around 28 to 30 years old. And what they do is they begin to explore the ethical roots of those ideals. And it inevitably leads them into discussions of spirituality. So they begin to encounter people like Dionysius, the Areopagite. They begin to encounter, they use the education that they've gotten to dig in and do their own exploration to try to find out who the people were that were the wellspring of the ideals that they've been taught. And they go back and they find these people and they start to discover these really strange things about them. For example, that Socrates, who is held up to them by their elders as an ideal, turns out to have been basically executed by the city-state, because they felt that his trying to train the young people to actually think for themselves was subversive to the city-state. Okay, and so that they insisted that he be terminated. And that they encounter this over and over and over again, but they discover that these people who were saying strange things, like Parmenides, that, for example, that one of the pre-Socratics, the pre-Socratics, the Stoics, in ancient Greek history, that they were espousing these rather extraordinary beliefs, talking about atoms, that everything in the whole cosmos is made up of atoms, and that everything is ultimately divisible into these separate atoms. And they began to talk about mixtures and different substances in the universe and how they interact with each other, and that they start having these what might be perceived as very peculiar conversations about the basis, the biological and physical basis of reality itself. And they begin to then eschew the set of beliefs in the institutional structures that things are exactly as they seem. And that they'll begin to discuss the fact that, for example, that a chair isn't a chair. That a chair is in fact made up of a whole series of these atoms that they were talking about. And what it is the incarnation of an idea of a chair that Plato talks about in the realm of the forms. And they begin to have these kind of discussions. And what happens is the idealist generation in Western civilization begin to go back into this history and discover these people who have been talking about these strange things. And so there's an entire period during the age of the idealists where the idealists go back in and begin to explore these things. And in fact, in generation after generation after generation, they actually encounter certain types of inebriants, actually encounter certain type of natural substances in their culture that can engender a kind of an altered state of consciousness. And so that a lot of the writers that one encounters back in those times, they discovered that they were partaking in certain type of mysterious rites in secret, where they would share certain types of drinks, etc., that would move them into a state of altered consciousness. And they would begin to discuss things in that altered state of consciousness. And it isn't just the boomers that we're talking about here that happen to have encountered LSD and marijuana. It's people that date all the way back into the pre-Socratics and every one of the ages since then. And what they discovered is that these people, when they come to their adulthood, these idealists, they eventually get to the point where they get to be maybe 60 years old, 60 to 65 years old, and they begin to reminisce with each other. They begin to gather back together again and reminisce about that decade when they surged forward and challenged the culture and stood up against them and attempted to persuade the culture to live up to its ideals. And they begin to reminisce about those halcyon days. And they begin to suspect that their best days may well have been now behind them. But, and this is the point that we've come together to discuss, they have consistently, in all 4 cycles of the 100-year cycles that have been investigated, for example, by William Strauss and Neil Howe, every single time the idealists begin to lose heart and gather themselves together and reminisce about those halcyon days of that decade of the surge, that what happens is they discover that because the culture refused to listen to them, refused to take heed of the challenge that was raised by the idealist generation, of attempting to put forth the ideals so that the culture could renew itself, refresh itself, water its roots of its ideals, and reform its culture. That because they refused to do that, a major secular crisis befalls the society as a whole. And that what they point out, Strauss and Howe have pointed out, that, for example, in Western civilization, this particular sequence was, their research went back to the beginning in the 1590s in Europe, when in fact the young people, a young idealist generation, rose up and began to challenge the ecclesial authorities and the royalists in Europe, and challenged them, and they were confronted by the passage of a set of statutes called the Acts of Uniformity. There were actual pieces of legislation that were passed in countries in Europe insisting that everybody believed the same thing in the field of religion, and that they wedded the religion to the state, and they insisted that everybody believed this. And in fact, from 1593 to 1610, there were major public executions that were carried out against people who refused to conform to these statutes of conformity. This is what in fact caused members of an entire generation, that idealist generation, to flee from Europe and to cross the ocean and come to North America. That is in fact true, all that stuff that you heard about the Pilgrims, that they actually came over here. It was a young idealist generation where the men and women shared equally. It was brother this and sister that, and they owned their property in common, and they set up a New England and a New Haven and a New Bedford. They set up a new shining city on the hill here in North America, and in fact were extraordinarily well met by the indigenous population, and that they were very friendly, and they helped each other, and they learned how to farm, and they learned how to raise corn, they learned how to hunt, they learned how to do all of those things in that first generation. And this was the very first major secular crisis that drove the people from an idealist generation to the shores of North America. So this was the first of the series of idealists in the 100-year cycle. And that was in the 17th century. In the 18th century, the next major secular crisis, of course, was the American Revolution. The entire American Revolution that went on for a period of some 15 years, that went on from 1765 all the way to 1781 with the creation of the new Constitution. That entire 15-year period or so was another major secular crisis that occurred in the Western civilization here in North America. And as you recall, a similar series of events were taking place in Europe in the French Revolution that went on during this exact same period of time. And so this major secular crisis of the 17th century or 18th century took place during that period of time. And the next secular crisis, of course, was the American Revolution, or excuse me, the Civil War, the American Civil War that took place. It took place from 1857 with the Dred Scott decision up to 1868 with the end of the Civil War. And then the next 100-year cycle the major secular crisis that occurred was the Great Depression in 1929. It went all the way through a major worldwide war up into the end of 1945. And so that what happened is at the end of that particular secular crisis, that major secular crisis of the 20th century, a new idealist generation began to be born. And that was the baby boomers. The baby boomer generation, the big 60s generation that we all hear so much about, and that those of us who are part of it are quite proud of, I might add. And you may pick up some of that while we're talking. So what happened is that actually beginning in February of 1943, with the defeat of the Fifth Army of Germany in front of the gates of Stalingrad, this was 6 months after the Japanese fleet had been destroyed at the Battle of Midway in June of 1942. From that point forward, everyone basically knew that the war was going to be won by the Allies, and that it was a process for another 2 years of basically mopping this thing up. But everybody began to know that, and so all of the people that began to be born from February of 1943 all the way for the next 21 years, all the way until November of 1963, with the assassination of President Kennedy. That entire era that gave birth here in North America to 82 million idealist generation members. The biggest generation in the history of the world. The best educated generation in the history of the world up to that point. The most idealistic generation in the history of the world up to that point. And that's we see played over and over again every 100-year cycle. Then what happened, of course, is that after that generation rose up and challenged the state power here in the United States from basically 1965 to 1975 or 1978, that whole decade of the 60s, and those of us who lived through it know that it didn't go from 1960 to 1970. It went from about 1965 to 1978. But that whole surge took place. And what happened is after that, in 1980, when Ronald Reagan and George Bush came to power, what they did is they pushed back and they intentionally began a whole series of policies that began to try to teach the next upcoming generation to be cynical and jaded and to not accept the kind of fuzzy-headed thinking of the idealists, these dope-smoking, rock and rolling, ne'er-do-wells from the 60s generation. And you got an entire kind of X generation that became quite prominent and very classically a reactive generation because they were targeted by the previous civic generation of the 20th century, the World War II generation of Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush and all of those people that were of that the previous civic generation of the previous century. They were targeted and they were taught to become disenchanted with the thinking of the 60s. And so you had a classic reactive generation that was born. And what's happening now is the next civic generation is being born. That is you guys. You guys are the civic generation of the 21st century. We are the idealist generation of the 21st century. And what we discovered at the end of every one of these cycles, or in the midst of these cycles, is that when the idealist generation gets to be between 60 and 65 years old and begins to reminisce about those old great halcyon days, what happens is the next secular crisis begins to set upon the culture. And what happens is the civic generation that has faced, the new civic generation of that 100-year cycle, is confronted by this crisis and has to figure out how to reform the culture, how to save the society from this crisis. And what they do is they reach out and begin to dialogue with the members of the idealist generation who have been biding their time and keeping faith with the ideals, to begin to dialogue about how those ideals can be brought to bear upon the present crisis and resolve that crisis successfully. And that is what is in the process of happening now. What you don't know is that the reason that courses like this are starting to be offered and stuff now is because the boomers, who are all between getting now the senior class of the boomers, that are now by 65 to 69 years old, have been gathering together and saying, what is it that we have come to discover out here in the world over these past 40 years, now that we're grown up? What have we discovered? And how can this be of assistance to the new civic generation coming up? And that's what's happening now. In the nature of the secular crisis that we're going to be confronted by, and as you know now, it doesn't require anything more than just looking at the headlines every day. And on November 1st, as you know, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change of the United Nations has now come out with its 5th and final analysis of the global climate change. And it's absolutely clear now that the major institutional structures left unattended by you and us are going to continue right apace, generating massive global greenhouse gas emissions. $600 billion has been invested in the past year by the major oil and natural gas companies to try to figure out how to get more new gas, how to frack, everywhere, and get coal tar out of Canada, pump it through pipelines all the way down into Louisiana to the Gulf Coast. Now that they can get the crap off the water from the last blowout they had down there, and they aren't even stopping. And so but for a significant intervention on the part of you, the new civic generation, in partnership with us, the idealists of the 21st century, that this catastrophe is getting set to befall all of the people of the world. We're talking about major, 7 to 8 degree Fahrenheit changes in the global mean temperature over the next 50 years. We're talking about sea rises that are going to inundate the major coastlines of the entire planet up to 20 miles. We're talking about the melting of the polar ice caps. We're talking about the dissolution of the ice caps and the ice sheets to actually put 70% of all of the potable water on the planet into the oceans. Okay, there's 75%, there's actually 78% of all the water on the planet is salt water, but the potable water that's available in the ice sheets is melting, and it's flowing into the oceans. And it's changing the density of the oceans, of the salt water, and it's changing the salination levels, and because of the change of the density in the water, the underwater currents are starting to rise to the surface and dissipate. These are the underwater currents that carry the warm water from the equatorial regions up into the northern temperate zones, where 70% of all the food on the planet is grown. And so what we're in the process of looking at losing 70% of all of the drinking water and potable water on the planet in the next 50 years. Okay? And what are they doing in Congress? You get the International Panel on Climate Change says we have to reduce the annual global greenhouse gas emissions by 70% by 2050. And so Congress recommends 7%. Like they just got the decimal place in the wrong spot. And Obama comes back saying, look at, how about 17%? Right? And so what they're doing is they're actually passing affirmative legislation that explicitly, affirmatively authorizes all of the corporations to pump tens of millions of tons of sludge into the atmosphere every single year. And their lawyers cite those federal statutes as a defense when you try to sue them for destroying the entire atmosphere. And they say, well, we've been authorized by the federal government to do this. And they raise it as an affirmative defense. So that the lawyers that are hired by these people are going to try to craft an entire system that is going to continue to destroy the entire planet. Because when you get 20 miles of inundation along the seacoast of the world, you're going to then contaminate another 1/3 of the remaining potable water on the planet after the ice caps have melted. Because you're going to contaminate with salt water the underwater aquifer, the underground aquifers. To say nothing about the radioactive materials that are in the 403 nuclear reactors that are built within 20 miles of the seas, all across the world.
Why? Because they want to get out the seawater to cool them. Why? Because if they don't cool them, they'll blow up and kill everybody. Yeah. So this is what you're looking at now. You're looking at the salt contamination of another 1/3 of the drinking water on the planet. You're looking at the radioactive contamination of the water when those nuclear reactors are covered with water. And you're looking at 53% of the entire population of the human family living within 30 miles of the seacoast all around the world, having to get up and move into territory that is in fact owned by other people. And that you're going to get major confrontations between those peoples in that mass migration. And you're going to get water wars over the remaining little bits of potable water that exist. Okay? And yet they're all sitting there twiddling their thumbs, responding to the financing of the major by the major corporations to fund the elections of these congressmen and senators, and everybody knows it. I mean, it's like we don't have to talk about this up in the upper room. Everybody knows this. Everybody knows that the corporations are just buying the congressmen and senators. And everybody sits here and just says, maybe someone else is going to do something about this. Okay? Well, the fact is they're not. The fact is that one of the things that I learned long ago is that there isn't someone else that's going to do this. People say to me all the time, how the heck do you end up in the middle of these kind of lawsuits and cases that you've done down through the years? I mean, it just sounds bizarre that you've been in the middle of all these things. Well, the fact is, when I got in the middle of those things, they weren't that big a deal. It's just that they came to be so, because we confronted them and we marshaled the forces of all the information and knowledge that we had as well-educated people to marshal those forces against them. And so they ended up having to deal with these things all the way up into the United States Supreme Court. And so what they've done, of course, is they've packed the courts. They turned around and packed the courts. 83% of all the federal judges now in the United States have been appointed by Richard Nixon, Ronald Reagan, George H.W. Bush, or W. Bush. Okay? And these are not just regular judges. These are Federalist Society judges. These are judges that have the most stingy attitude about individual human rights and constitutional liberties. They have an overinflated view of the power of the state. We actually are now looking at federal court decisions in which the United States Congress, initiated by the right-wing Republicans in the House of Representatives, proposed a statute, the National Defense Authorization Act of 2012, in which they actually proposed that now, for the first time, United States military forces can arrest American citizens here in North America without any probable cause to believe that you've committed any crime, based merely upon a conclusion on the part of an administrative person in the United States military that you may be, in fact, there's reasonable grounds to suspect that you may be providing significant assistance to a group that has been designated by the executive branch of the government as a group that harbors hostile intentions toward the United States government or any of our allies. And if they come to that determination, they can sweep you up, they can take you into custody, they can hold you indefinitely and refuse to allow you to have a lawyer, refuse to allow you to contact anybody in your family to tell them where you are, and they do not have to provide any type of hearing for you. And if they do have a hearing for you, it can be in front of a military tribunal. And you have no right to counsel. And you have no right to cross-examine the people who are providing evidence against you. In fact, you don't even have to be told what the evidence is against you, because it might jeopardize the national security of the United States by revealing their sources and methods by which they got the information against you, which more likely than not is the illegal wiretaps on your telephones. Or perhaps the photographs of your license plates, which the city of Santa Cruz has now been given a major grant by the Department of Homeland Security to purchase license plate readers, which they're now putting around the city, and they're photographing everybody's license plates. And they're keeping those license plate records all in a big place up in San Francisco, run by the Homeland Security Division. They monitor the entire pattern of your license, of where it's been, all during your everyday travels around. Okay, and so that's the kind of thing that's going on right now, and people are all sitting here hoping someone else will do something about that. The fact is, that's your job. That is your job as potential public intellectuals. That it's your job to be able to understand the details of those things. It's your job to understand the historical sources of the rights, privileges, and immunities of citizens of the United States that abide under our Constitution, that flow from the natural law theory. And it's to be able to articulate those values and to confront the institutions and to confront the society, to mobilize an entire generation. Because, make no doubt about this, that as the crisis starts to unfold of the major global climate change and the massive increased storms and the huge tornadoes that in fact have never been seen before in places where they've never occurred before, and massive hurricanes of scales unknown that wash water inland all around the coasts, and whole cities being swept away, that as this is coming to pass, you can be certain that the national security state apparatus that has been rolled into place under the guise of protecting us against terrorism is going to be invoked against anybody who stands in the way of the national security state attempting to respond to those crises. Okay? This is the secular crisis of the 21st century. It is confronting us as our respective generations. Our generation of 82 million baby boomer idealists, your generation as the second largest generation in the history of the world, 75 million of you here in the United States, in the same ratios around the world, that you are the sonic boom babies. And you are the power, because combining our 82 million with your 75 million, we dwarf all of the other generations. The X generation has only 42 million people in it. Okay? The remnants of the Korean War generation have only 26 million people in it left. And the World War II generation, the previous civic generation of the 20th century, is virtually all gone. Now, virtually all gone. Okay? So we are the people who are responsible for addressing this major secular crisis. And we have to know that the constituted powers, the corporate powers, the banking powers, the Democratic Republican Party powers are not going to, in fact, address this adequately, because they've designed an entire scheme by which the corporations are not only immunized, the owners of the stock are immunized legally against any liability for what they're doing, and the management is completely immunized. The only liability goes to the actual assets of the corporation itself. And they've set up sub-corporations and drawn assets out of them to protect themselves against liability. And so that there's no deterrent inside that structure against them continuing to do just exactly what they're doing. And so radical change has to come about. And the question is, does radical change have to be pursued by violent means? Or can, in fact, there still be major revolutionary change brought about by means of intelligent discourse and persuasive argument and concrete organizing and mobilizing of people in a society that is still allowed to vote and in a state where you have referenda, that all of these things are available to us. And the fact of the matter is, we are absolutely duty-bound to use every single one of these resources that we have available to us before the resort to violence. And make no mistake about it, those are the choices. Because our human family cannot tolerate having done to us what is being done to us now. And if it cannot be resolved peacefully, it will in fact have to be resolved violently. Thus the issue of revolution. Thus the issue of the intellectuals. Thus the constant discussion in university communities about the viability of revolution against unjust structures. And that the universities have historically been a place of discussion of those very issues until more recently, when in fact the discussion doesn't go on at all. Okay, so that what we want you to be able to do here in this course is to confront these issues and come to try to understand that the only source of power that is going to push you to the absolute extreme limits of your intellectual capabilities to find peaceful solutions to this is a spiritual life. Whatever that means. Because if you approach this simply secularly and seek out answers solely intellectually, you're going to find that they do not exist. Because the other side is as intelligent as we are. And they are recruiting very intelligent people out of all the universities, state and private, to protect what they're doing. And so that the secret resource that we possess as the intelligentsia is a knowledge of the Dionysian secret that is touched upon in the Phi Beta Kappa conversations. That you in this course are going to be presented with this issue. And I will again, in closing, just give you one short story of the number of them that you'll hear during the course of our 20 gatherings together, that gives you some insight into where we're going. On December 20th of 1967, this is just before that great halcyon year of 1968, the famous year of 1968 with the Democratic National Convention and the riots in the streets in Chicago, and the assassination of Martin Luther King in April, the assassination of Bobby Kennedy, with him running and when Lyndon Johnson withdrew over the Vietnam War, with a war in the streets and cars being turned over in the streets of the country, that on December 20th of 1967, Professor Crane Brinton, the 35-year chairman of the Department of Intellectual History at Harvard University, was asked to deliver his final lecture at Harvard University. And he was asked to identify the single most important intellectual insight that had been come to by the greatest minds in Western culture based upon all of his studies over a period of 50 years at Harvard and Oxford. And he came to Lowell Hall, actually, on December 20th, 1967. They had to move his lecture to a bigger hall because people were coming in from all around the world to be there for his final lecture. And I remember I was there at Lowell Hall, and the place was filled with all these different generations of men who had him up to that point in time. And he comes before the group, and he said, "I've been asked to address here in my final lecture as the chairman of the Department of Intellectual History at Harvard University, the single most important intellectual insight arrived at by the greatest minds in Western civilization. And that insight is this," he said. I believe that all of the greatest minds in Western civilization have come to realize that we as a species are on the very brink of the next step in our biological evolution, and that we are evolving a new faculty by means of which we are going to be able to, just like seeing or hearing, a faculty by means of which we can directly, experientially encounter the unitive phenomenon that bonds every single ultimately irreducible integer of matter in the entire physical universe into one single harmonious whole. And by means of this direct experience, each individual is capable of discerning what conduct on the part of human beings, both individual and collective, is either harmonious with or disharmonious to the natural order of the universe. And I think that's why so many of you young men are refusing to go and fight in this war in Vietnam. And I will say in closing that I think that exact same truism is why you are here tonight as members of your generation, to discover this secret, to find out what it is that the greatest minds in Western civilization and in Eastern civilization have said about this secret fact of what is going on right now, and how they've related to it intellectually, how they've related to it experientially, how they've related to it through religious institutions, how they've related to it through philosophical discussions and scientific inquiry. That's the purpose of this course, to prepare you to develop this spiritual faculty, which is our secret resource, by means of which we will be able to quest to the very limits of our capacities to find the peaceful solution, so as to avoid the Holocaust.